Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to another gentle journey through the dustier corners of history, where we'll explore the stories that textbooks prefer to skip over. Tonight, we're venturing into a world where bringing new life into existence was less miracle and more elaborate game of Russian roulette with mortality itself. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply need a break from the relentless pace of modern life, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me. Before we begin our exploration of medieval pregnancy, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all connected across time zones by these shared stories of our ancestors. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind, please consider subscribing. We have many more forgotten chapters of human experience waiting to be told, each one designed to ease you into peaceful rest while expanding your understanding of how far we've truly come. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let the soft weight of evening settle around you like a well-worn blanket. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time when pregnancy wasn't announced with carefully staged photos or gender reveal parties, but whispered about in hushed tones between women who understood that every child conceived was a roll of dice with death itself. Imagine, if you will, waking up in a world where morning sickness wasn't just an inconvenience to be managed with crackers and ginger tea, but a potential harbinger of doom, where the absence of your monthly bleeding could signal either the joy of new life or the beginning of a 9-month countdown to what many women considered their likely execution date. This was medieval pregnancy, a journey so fraught with danger, superstition, and medical ignorance that it makes our modern complaints about swollen ankles and heartburn seem almost laughably trivial. Picture yourself as a young woman in 14th century England, perhaps the daughter of a merchant or a minor lord's wife. You've just realized that your body is changing in ways that both terrify and exhilarate you. But unlike today's expectant mothers, you won't be rushing to schedule an ultrasound or picking out nursery colours. Instead, you'll be praying to every saint you can name, consulting wise women whose remedies are equal parts folklore and desperation, and trying not to think about the graveyard behind your village church, where so many stones mark the brief lives of women who died in childbed. The medieval world had no understanding of germs, no concept of proper nutrition during pregnancy, and medical knowledge that would make a modern first aid course seem like advanced surgical training. Pregnancy was viewed through a lens of religious mysticism, ancient superstitions, and theories about the human body that were so wildly incorrect they bordered on fantasy. Women were told that their wombs wandered around their bodies like lost sheep, that their monthly cycles were connected to the phases of the moon, and that the sex of their unborn child could be determined by which side they slept on. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the simple, stark reality that medieval women faced. Pregnancy was likely to kill you, not might kill you, not could potentially cause complications, but was statistically likely to end your life. Maternal mortality rates in medieval Europe were so astronomical that bearing children was quite literally more dangerous than going to war. A knight riding into battle had better odds of returning home than a woman entering labour had of surviving to hold her child. The numbers, when we can piece them together from fragmentary historical records, are sobering. Some historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 women died in childbirth, or from complications related to pregnancy. Others suggest the figure might have been even higher in some regions and time periods. What we know for certain is that medieval graveyards are filled with the remains of young women who died in their reproductive years, often buried with the infants they couldn't deliver safely. This wasn't due to some inherent flaw in medieval women or a particularly harsh historical period. It was the inevitable result of a perfect storm of ignorance, superstition, and social conditions that turned pregnancy into a death sentence for countless women. They lacked basic understanding of anatomy, had no access to clean birthing environments, relied on medical treatments that often made things worse, and lived in a society that viewed women's suffering in childbirth as divinely ordained punishment for Eve's original sin. The very moment a medieval woman suspected she might be pregnant, she entered a world of anxiety that modern mothers can barely comprehend. There were no pregnancy tests, no early ultrasounds to confirm a healthy fetus, no prenatal vitamins or carefully monitored weight gain. Instead, there were folk remedies that ranged from harmless to deadly, religious rituals that promised divine protection but offered no practical help, and a community of women who shared their wisdom in whispers, knowing that their accumulated knowledge was all that stood between life and death. The signs of early pregnancy in medieval times were interpreted through a mixture of observation and superstition that seems almost comical today. Women were told to watch for changes in their complexion, the condition of their hair, and even the taste of their saliva. Some believed that a pregnant woman's urine would rust a nail, or that her breath would tarnish silver. Others looked for signs in dreams, convinced that certain nighttime visions could predict not only pregnancy, but the sex and fate of the unborn child. Once pregnancy was confirmed, the real terror began. Medieval women knew that they had entered a countdown to what many considered their likely death date. They began making preparations that modern expectant mothers would find heartbreaking. Writing wills, arranging for the care of their existing children, and saying what might be final goodbyes to their families. Some made pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to patron saints of childbirth, hoping that divine intervention might tip the odds in their favour. The medical care available to pregnant women in medieval times was a bizarre mixture of ancient wisdom, religious mysticism, and treatments that seem almost designed to make things worse. Physicians, when they were available at all, operated on theories about the human body that bore no resemblance to reality. They believed that pregnancy was caused by an excess of hot, moist humours in the woman's body, and that the developing child was essentially a parasite that needed to be carefully managed, lest it consume the mother entirely. The treatments prescribed for pregnant women were often more dangerous than the conditions they were meant to address. Bloodletting was considered essential to maintain the proper balance of humours, despite the fact that pregnant women needed every drop of blood they could retain. Purging with powerful herbs was thought to cleanse the body of impurities, even though it left women weak and malnourished at a time when they needed strength most. Some physicians prescribed exercises so strenuous that they would be considered dangerous even by modern standards, while others recommended complete bed rest that left women's muscles weak and unprepared for the physical demands of labour. The social conditions surrounding medieval pregnancy were equally challenging. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and pregnant women were expected to continue their daily labours almost until the moment of birth. A peasant woman might be working in the fields when labour began, while even noble ladies were expected to maintain their household duties and social obligations throughout their pregnancies. The idea of maternity leave or modified duties was utterly foreign to a world where survival depended on everyone contributing their full measure of work. The superstitions surrounding medieval pregnancy were both numerous and often dangerous. Women were told to avoid certain foods, wear specific amulets, and perform elaborate rituals to ensure the health of their unborn children. Some of these beliefs were harmless, but others could be deadly. Pregnant women were sometimes forbidden from eating foods that might actually have provided essential nutrients, while others were encouraged to consume substances that we now know to be toxic to developing fetuses. The religious dimension of medieval pregnancy added another layer of anxiety and fear. The Church taught that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, and that women who sought to ease their suffering were defying divine will. This meant that pain relief during labour was not only unavailable, but was actually considered sinful. Women were expected to suffer in silence, viewing their agony as a form of penance that might earn them salvation. As we delve deeper into this world of medieval pregnancy, we'll explore the daily realities that expectant mothers faced, the treatments they endured, and the remarkable courage they displayed in the face of almost certain death. We'll meet the midwives who served as their primary caregivers, examine the birthing chambers where so many women drew their last breaths, and understand how the simple act of bringing new life into the world became the most dangerous thing a medieval woman could do. The story of medieval pregnancy is not just a tale of medical ignorance and social oppression, though it certainly includes both. It's also a story of human resilience, of women who faced unimaginable odds with courage and determination, and of a society that slowly, painfully, began to understand that the death of mothers in childbirth was not an inevitable fact of life, but a problem that could be solved through knowledge, compassion, and better care. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself imagine those long-ago women, heavy with child and heavy with fear, preparing for a journey that might end in joy or tragedy. Their stories remind us how precious our modern medical knowledge truly is, and how far we've come from a time when pregnancy was less a celebration of life than a dance with death. So, settle back now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. We're about to explore a world where every kick from an unborn baby was both a blessing and a reminder of the dangers ahead, where women face their greatest fear with nothing but folk wisdom, prayer, and the support of other women who understood that in medieval times, bringing life into the world was the bravest thing anyone could do. The moment a medieval woman realized she carried new life within her, she entered what can only be described as a peculiar form of imprisonment. Not behind bars or stone walls, but within a web of restrictions, taboos, and bizarre medical theories that would govern every aspect of her existence for the next 9 months. Her body, once her own to command, became a vessel subject to the opinions, superstitions, and often dangerous interventions of everyone around her. Picture, if you will, young Eleanor, wife of a wool merchant in 13th century York. The morning she first suspects her condition, her world transforms entirely. Gone are the days when she might walk freely through the market, sample the baker's bread, or even choose which direction to sleep in her bed. From this moment forward, every decision must be filtered through the elaborate system of beliefs that medieval society had constructed around pregnancy, a system so complex and contradictory that navigating it required the skills of a diplomat and the patience of a saint. The first challenge Eleanor faces is confirmation of her condition. In our modern world, a simple test can provide certainty within minutes, but medieval women lived in a realm of uncertainty that stretched for months. The wise women of her community would examine her urine, holding it up to candlelight and studying its color, clarity, and even its smell. Some claimed they could divine pregnancy by mixing the woman's urine with wine and observing how it separated. Others insisted that only by burying a barley seed watered with the woman's urine could they determine her condition, watching to see if the grain sprouted more quickly than normal. These methods, absurd as they seem to us now, were taken with deadly seriousness. A false positive could subject a woman to months of unnecessary restrictions and treatments, while a false negative might delay the crucial preparations that could mean the difference between life and death. Eleanor, like countless women before her, would have to wait for the more obvious signs of pregnancy to appear, all while following the precautions that might protect a child who might not even exist. Once her condition was confirmed, Eleanor's world would shrink dramatically. Medieval medical theory held that pregnant women were in a state of dangerous imbalance, their bodies heated by the growing child and prone to corruption from external influences. She would be forbidden from attending certain religious ceremonies, warned away from particular foods, and advised to avoid the company of people who might bring bad luck or evil influences to her unborn child. The dietary restrictions alone were enough to drive a woman to distraction. Medieval physicians believed that everything a pregnant woman consumed would directly affect her child's development. But their understanding of nutrition was so fundamentally flawed that their advice often did more harm than good. Eleanor might be told to avoid fish on certain days, not because of any nutritional concern, but because the church associated fish with fasting and penance. She might be forbidden from eating eggs during particular seasons, warned away from certain vegetables that were thought to cause birthmarks, or encouraged to consume foods that we now know could be harmful to developing babies. The treatises written by medieval physicians reveal a worldview so divorced from reality that reading them today feels like exploring an alien culture. They seriously debated whether pregnant women should be allowed to look at ugly people, fearing that the sight might deform their unborn children. They warned against pregnant women witnessing violence or attending executions, not out of concern for their emotional well-being, but because they believed the shock might cause the child to be born with violent tendencies. Some physicians insisted that pregnant women should surround themselves only with beautiful objects and pleasant sights, leading to the bizarre practice of hanging attractive paintings in birthing chambers and ensuring that expectant mothers spent their time contemplating lovely gardens or works of art. While this might sound like a pleasant way to spend a pregnancy, it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how human development actually works, and often led to additional restrictions and anxieties for women who couldn't afford to create such perfect environments. The social isolation that accompanied medieval pregnancy was perhaps even more challenging than the physical restrictions. Pregnant women were often segregated from normal social life, considered too delicate for regular activities, and too spiritually vulnerable for full participation in community events. Eleanor would find herself excluded from festivals, discouraged from traveling, and advised to limit her interactions with anyone who might bring negative influences into her life. This isolation was compounded by the secrecy that surrounded pregnancy in medieval culture. Unlike our modern celebration of expectant motherhood, medieval pregnancies were often kept hidden for as long as possible. The high rate of miscarriage and infant mortality meant that announcing a pregnancy too early was considered both unlucky and potentially embarrassing. Women learned to conceal their conditions through careful dress and behavior, sharing their secret only with their closest female relatives and the midwives who would eventually attend their births. The clothing worn by pregnant medieval women reflects this desire for concealment, rather than the form-fitting maternity wear that celebrates the pregnant form today. Medieval women wore loose, flowing garments designed to hide their changing bodies. The wealthy might afford specially constructed gowns with hidden lacings that could be loosened as needed, while poorer women simply wore their regular clothes until they no longer fit, then made do with borrowed garments or hastily altered hand-me-downs. The psychological toll of medieval pregnancy was immense. Eleanor would spend her days surrounded by reminders of mortality, from the women in her community who had died in childbirth to the countless infants who had lived only days or weeks. She would hear stories of difficult labors, deformed babies, and women who suffered for days before finally succumbing to complications that medieval medicine could neither prevent nor treat. The religious context of medieval pregnancy added another layer of psychological burden. The church taught that pregnancy was both a blessing and a curse, a reminder of women's role in original sin and their divinely appointed suffering. Pregnant women were encouraged to view their condition as an opportunity for spiritual purification through physical suffering, a chance to atone for Eve's disobedience through their own pain and sacrifice. This religious framework meant that Eleanor would spend her pregnancy in a constant state of spiritual examination, confessing her sins more frequently, attending additional masses, and performing acts of penance designed to ensure divine protection for her child. She would be encouraged to make pilgrimages to shrines associated with safe childbirth, even though the physical demands of such journeys often posed additional risks to both mother and child. The superstitions surrounding medieval pregnancy were so numerous and contradictory that following them all would have been impossible. Eleanor might be told to avoid looking at the moon during certain phases, to sleep only on her left side, to wear specific amulets or carry particular herbs. She would be warned against tying knots lest her labor be prolonged, and advised to avoid sharp objects that might cut her child in the womb. Some of these superstitions were harmless, even comforting in their own way. The practice of wearing coral beads, for instance, was believed to protect both mother and child from evil influences. While the beads had no actual protective power, they served as tangible reminders of the community's care and support for the pregnant woman. Other superstitions, however, could be genuinely dangerous. Some women were advised to fast extensively during pregnancy, believing that a smaller baby would be easier to deliver, not understanding that malnourishment increased the risks for both mother and child. The medical treatments available to pregnant medieval women were often worse than no treatment at all. Physicians would prescribe bloodletting to balance the humours, not understanding that pregnant women needed every drop of blood they possessed. They would recommend purgative herbs to cleanse the system, unaware that these treatments could trigger miscarriage or premature labour. Some prescribed violent exercises designed to strengthen the mother for labour, while others insisted on complete bed rest that left women weak and unprepared for the physical demands ahead. The instruments used by medieval physicians and midwives were crude and often dangerous. Surgical tools were rarely cleaned properly, spreading infection from one patient to another. The forceps that might save lives in difficult deliveries wouldn't be invented for centuries, leaving women to labour for days with babies who couldn't be born naturally. Even the birthing chairs used by some midwives, while an improvement over lying flat, were often uncomfortable and positioned in ways that actually made delivery more difficult. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, she would begin the grim preparations that every medieval woman understood to be necessary. She would write her will, arrange for the care of her existing children, and make peace with family members from whom she might be estranged. These weren't morbid obsessions, but practical necessities in a world where maternal death was so common that failing to prepare for it would be considered irresponsible. The birthing chamber itself would be prepared weeks in advance, transformed from a normal room into a space designed for what might be either the greatest joy or the final tragedy of Eleanor's life. The windows would be sealed and covered, creating the dark, stuffy environment that medieval medicine believed necessary for safe delivery. Religious artifacts would be brought in, from crosses and holy relics to images of saints associated with childbirth. Herbs would be burned to purify the air, though the smoke often made breathing more difficult for women already struggling with the physical demands of labour. The community of women who would attend Eleanor's birth would begin gathering days before labour was expected to begin. These weren't medical professionals in any modern sense, but rather neighbours, relatives, and local wise women whose knowledge came from experience rather than formal training. Some had attended dozens of births and possessed genuine skill and intuition. Others were present more for emotional support than medical expertise, offering prayers, encouragement, and the comfort of familiar faces during the ordeal ahead. The rituals surrounding medieval labour were elaborate and deeply meaningful to the women who participated in them. Special prayers would be recited, protective amulets placed around the birthing chamber, and specific foods prepared to give the labouring woman strength. These rituals served important psychological functions, providing structure and meaning to an experience that was otherwise largely beyond human control. As we continue our journey through the world of medieval pregnancy, we'll explore the terrifying reality of labour itself, the women who served as midwives and birth attendants, and the countless ways that society's misunderstanding of female anatomy and reproduction turned the miracle of birth into a recurring tragedy that claimed the lives of mothers and babies alike. But for now, let your mind rest with Eleanor as she moves through these months of waiting, surrounded by restrictions and superstitions, preparing for an ordeal that will test every ounce of strength and courage she possesses. Her story, multiplied across countless women throughout medieval Europe, reminds us how precious our modern understanding of pregnancy and childbirth truly is, and how brave these women were to face such odds with nothing but hope, prayer, and the support of other women who understood that bringing life into the medieval world required a special kind of heroism that history has too often forgotten. The weeks would crawl by with agonizing slowness as Eleanor's body changed in ways that medieval medicine could neither explain nor properly support. Her morning sickness, if she was unfortunate enough to experience it, would be interpreted through the lens of humoral theory as evidence that her body was struggling to maintain the delicate balance necessary for carrying a child. The physicians, when consulted, would nod gravely and prescribe treatments that ranged from the merely useless to the actively harmful. She might be told to consume bitter herbs that would supposedly settle her stomach, but actually made the nausea worse. She could be advised to have her blood drawn regularly, weakening her precisely when her body needed strength to support both herself and her growing child. Some physicians would recommend that she bind her belly tightly with strips of linen, believing this would help support the child, not understanding that restricting the natural expansion of her body could cause serious complications. The absence of any real understanding of fetal development meant that Eleanor would navigate her pregnancy in complete ignorance of what was actually happening inside her body. She wouldn't know that her child was developing fingers and toes, forming a beating heart, or growing the complex systems that would allow it to survive outside the womb. Instead, she would be told that the child was essentially a parasite, drawing strength from her body and potentially causing her death through its very presence. Medieval texts describe the developing child in terms that seem almost fantastical today. Some claimed that male children developed on the right side of the womb, while females grew on the left, and that a woman could influence her child's sex by sleeping on the appropriate side. Others insisted that the child's temperament was determined by the mother's diet, that eating too much meat would produce a violent child, while consuming excessive amounts of dairy would result in a cowardly one. The physical changes of pregnancy were interpreted through this same lens of ignorance and superstition. Eleanor's expanding belly would be measured not by medical professionals tracking the healthy growth of her child, but by wise women who claimed they could predict the baby's sex, health, and future by the shape and size of her bump. They would examine the way she carried the child, the condition of her skin, and even the pattern of her hair growth, all in service of predictions that had no basis in medical reality. Her changing appetite would be scrutinized for signs and omens. Cravings for sour foods were said to indicate a female child, while desires for salty or bitter flavors suggested a male. If she lost interest in food she had previously enjoyed, it was taken as evidence that the child was drawing too much strength from her body. These interpretations would then drive recommendations for dietary changes that often made her nutritional status worse rather than better. The swelling that commonly accompanies pregnancy would be viewed with particular alarm by medieval caregivers. They had no understanding of the normal fluid retention that occurs as a woman's body adapts to pregnancy, instead interpreting any swelling as evidence of dangerous imbalances in her humours. Eleanor might find herself subjected to aggressive treatments designed to reduce swelling, including powerful diuretic herbs that could dehydrate her and potentially harm her child. Sleep became another battleground of superstition and medical theory. Eleanor would be given detailed instructions about how to position herself during rest, which side to favour, and what time of day was safest for sleeping. Some advisors would insist that sleeping during daylight hours could confuse the child about when to be born, while others claimed that sleeping too deeply at night might allow evil spirits to influence the developing baby. The dreams that visited Eleanor during her pregnancy would be subjected to intense scrutiny and interpretation. Medieval society believed that pregnant women were particularly susceptible to prophetic dreams and supernatural visions, and any unusual or vivid dream would be analysed for clues about the child's future. Nightmares were taken as particularly ominous signs, sometimes leading to elaborate rituals designed to protect both mother and child from whatever evil influences might have been revealed in sleep. Her relationships with family and friends would shift in subtle but significant ways as her pregnancy progressed. The knowledge that she might not survive the birth would colour every interaction, lending a poignancy to simple conversations and daily activities. Children who might lose their mother would be drawn closer, while husbands face the very real possibility of becoming widowers with infants to raise alone. The economic implications of Eleanor's pregnancy would weigh heavily on the entire family. If she died in childbirth, the household would lose not only her labour, but also her skills in managing domestic affairs, caring for children, and contributing to the family's income through whatever work she performed. Preparations would need to be made for this eventuality, including arrangements for childcare, household management, and the care of the newborn, if it survived. The seasonal timing of pregnancy added another layer of concern for medieval families. Babies born during harsh winter months faced additional challenges, as did mothers who had to labour during the hottest summer days in stuffy, sealed birthing chambers. Spring births were generally preferred, as they allowed mothers to recover during mild weather and gave children their strongest chance of surviving their vulnerable first months. As Eleanor entered her final trimester, the preparations for birth would intensify dramatically. The birthing chamber would be thoroughly cleaned and prepared, though medieval understanding of cleanliness was quite different from our modern concept of sterility. Rushes would be laid on the floor, tapestries hung to block drafts, and religious artifacts arranged to provide spiritual protection during the ordeal ahead. The gathering of birth attendants would begin in earnest during these final months. The selection of midwives and other helpers was a crucial decision that could literally mean the difference between life and death. Eleanor would want women with experience, good reputations, and steady nerves, but she would also need to consider practical factors like availability, cost, and compatibility with her family's religious and social beliefs. The midwives of medieval Europe occupied a unique position in society, wielding considerable influence and respect, while simultaneously being viewed with suspicion and sometimes fear. These women had learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience rather than formal education, passing down knowledge that was often a mixture of genuine wisdom and dangerous superstition. The best midwives developed remarkable skills in managing normal births and even handling some complications, but they worked without the benefit of proper instruments, medications, or even basic understanding of anatomy. The tools available to medieval midwives were primitive by any standard. They might have birthing stools designed to help women labour in an upright position, but these were often uncomfortable and positioned incorrectly. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of their practice, including preparations that could strengthen contractions, ease pain, or supposedly speed delivery. Some of these remedies had genuine medicinal properties, while others were useless or even harmful. The social dynamics surrounding medieval birth were complex and deeply gendered. Men, including physicians, were generally excluded from the birthing chamber, leaving women to manage the entire process themselves. This created a parallel medical system run entirely by women, with its own traditions, remedies, and practices that were passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. The prayers and rituals that would accompany Eleanor's labour were as important as any medical intervention in the minds of medieval people. Special saints were invoked for protection during childbirth, including Saint Margaret, who was said to have been swallowed by a dragon and emerged unharmed, making her a powerful symbol for women hoping to survive the ordeal of birth. Religious relics might be brought into the chamber, holy water sprinkled around the room, and specific prayers recited at crucial moments during labour. The physical environment of the medieval birthing chamber was designed according to medical theories that we now know were counterproductive. Windows were sealed and covered with heavy cloth, creating a dark, airless space that medieval physicians believed was necessary for safe delivery. The lack of fresh air and natural light made the chamber stuffy and oppressive, while the darkness made it difficult for birth attendants to see what they were doing. Candles and oil lamps provided the only illumination, creating flickering shadows that could make even normal births seem more frightening and mysterious. The heat generated by these light sources, combined with the sealed windows and the physical exertion of labour, made the birthing chamber uncomfortably warm and humid. This environment, which medieval medicine considered ideal, actually increased the risk of infection and made the already difficult process of giving birth even more challenging. The foods prepared for labouring women reflected the same mixture of practical wisdom and medical ignorance that characterized medieval pregnancy care. Eleanor might be offered broths designed to give her strength, but she could also be encouraged to consume preparations that were supposed to speed her labour, but might actually make it more difficult. Some midwives insisted that labouring women should fast to make delivery easier, while others provided specific foods thought to have magical properties that would protect mother and child. The emotional support provided by the community of women attending the birth was perhaps the most valuable aspect of medieval childbirth care. These women understood the fears and challenges that Eleanor faced because they had experienced them themselves or witnessed them in others. They could offer encouragement, share stories of successful births, and provide the kind of emotional comfort that no medical intervention could replace. Yet even this support came wrapped in the grim realities of medieval life. Many of the women attending Eleanor's birth would have lost children of their own, either in infancy or through the death of mothers in childbirth. The stories they shared to encourage her would be balanced by the knowledge that not all stories ended happily, and that death was always a possibility that lurked just beyond the circle of candlelight in the birthing chamber. The rituals and superstitions surrounding the actual moment of birth were numerous and deeply ingrained in medieval culture. Eleanor would be advised about which direction to face during labour, what words to speak or avoid, and how to position her body to ensure the best outcome for both herself and her child. Some of these practices had practical value, while others were purely superstitious. But all were followed with the desperate hope that they might tip the scales in favour of survival. As we prepare to explore the terrifying reality of medieval labour itself, we leave Eleanor in these final days of pregnancy, surrounded by the elaborate preparations that her society believed necessary for safe delivery. She faces an ordeal that will test every ounce of her physical and emotional strength, supported by a community of women who understand both the hopes and fears that accompany the approach of birth, in a world where bringing new life into existence remained humanity's most dangerous endeavour. The morning Eleanor first felt the telltale quickening within her womb, a flutter like butterfly wings against her ribs, marked the beginning of what medieval society considered the most perilous phase of pregnancy. This moment, when the child first announced its presence through movement, was both celebrated and feared in equal measure, for it meant that Eleanor had crossed an invisible threshold from which there might be no return. The quickening, as it was known, brought with it a new set of anxieties and preparations. Medieval medical theory held that once a child began to move, it was actively drawing life force from its mother, potentially weakening her to the point of death. Eleanor would now be watched even more carefully by the women in her community, examined for signs that the child was taking too much from her body. Her complexion would be scrutinized for pallor, her energy levels monitored for dangerous decline. The remedies prescribed for this stage of pregnancy were often bizarre and sometimes harmful. Eleanor might be given tonics made from ground pearls and gold dust, substances that medieval physicians believed could strengthen her against the drain of carrying a child. She could be advised to wear specific gemstones against her skin, each stone supposedly possessing properties that would protect her from the various dangers that threatened pregnant women in their final months. Some wise women would recommend that Eleanor consume the blood of specific animals, believing that this would replenish what the child was taking from her. Others might suggest that she eat the hearts of small birds, supposedly to give her courage for the ordeal ahead. These treatments, expensive and often disgusting, reflected the desperation that surrounded medieval pregnancy care and the willingness of families to try anything that might improve a woman's chances of survival. The physical discomforts that accompanied Eleanor's advancing pregnancy would be interpreted through the same lens of medical ignorance that coloured every aspect of medieval healthcare. The backaches that came from carrying additional weight would be attributed to the child's position in the womb, leading to recommendations for sleeping positions and daily activities that were supposed to encourage the baby to settle into a better location. The shortness of breath that naturally accompanied her expanding belly would be seen as evidence that the child was pressing against her vital organs, potentially stealing the very air from her lungs. Medieval physicians had developed elaborate theories about how the growing child affected every aspect of the mother's body and mind. They believed that pregnancy could fundamentally alter a woman's temperament, making her more prone to melancholy, anger, or irrational fears. Eleanor's moods would be carefully monitored by her family, and any signs of emotional distress would be treated as medical symptoms requiring intervention. The treatments for these supposed mood disorders were often more harmful than helpful. Eleanor might be subjected to additional bloodletting to balance her humours, or given herbal preparations that were supposed to calm her mind, but actually made her feel worse. Some physicians recommended that pregnant women in their final months should avoid all forms of excitement or strong emotion, leading to a kind of enforced isolation that could actually increase anxiety and depression. The superstitions surrounding the final months of pregnancy multiplied like weeds in a neglected garden. Eleanor would be warned against looking at deformed animals or people, lest her child be born with similar afflictions. She would be advised to avoid funerals, not out of consideration for her emotional well-being, but because medieval society believed that exposure to death could somehow mark her unborn child. Even attending church became complicated, as pregnant women were sometimes discouraged from participating in certain rituals or approaching specific altars that were considered too spiritually powerful for their delicate condition. The clothing that Eleanor wore during these final months reflected both practical needs and social expectations. Her garments would need to accommodate her changing body while maintaining the modesty that medieval society demanded of all women, but especially those in the vulnerable state of pregnancy. The wealthy might commission special gowns with hidden lacings and expandable panels, while women of more modest means made do with borrowed clothes or hastily altered garments that often fit poorly and provided little comfort. The symbolic importance of these garments extended beyond mere fashion. The colours Eleanor wore, the fabrics chosen, and even the way her clothes were fastened were all believed to influence her child's development and her own chances of survival. Blue was considered protective, while red was thought to encourage healthy blood flow. Certain patterns were believed to confuse evil spirits, while others might attract bad luck. The result was a complex system of dress codes that added yet another layer of anxiety to an already stressful time. As Eleanor entered her 8th month, the preparations for birth would intensify dramatically. The birthing chamber, which had been designated weeks earlier, would now be thoroughly prepared according to medieval custom. This was no simple matter of cleaning and arranging furniture, but rather an elaborate ritual that involved both practical preparations and magical protections designed to ensure the safest possible environment for the ordeal ahead. The chamber would be sealed against outside air, which medieval medicine considered dangerous to both mother and child during labour. Heavy tapestries would be hung over the windows, and any gaps in the walls would be stopped with cloth or other materials. This created an airless, stifling environment that modern medical knowledge recognizes as potentially dangerous, but which medieval physicians believed was essential for protecting the vulnerable mother and newborn from corrupting influences. Religious artifacts would be arranged throughout the room with careful attention to their protective properties. Crosses would be positioned at specific locations, holy relics placed where they could provide maximum spiritual protection, and blessed candles lit to drive away any evil spirits that might threaten the birth. Some families would bring in pieces of the true cross, fragments of saints' bones, or other precious religious items, believing that their presence could mean the difference between life and death. The birthing stool, if the family could afford one, would be blessed by a priest and positioned according to ancient traditions that specified its exact placement in relation to the room's other furnishings. These stools, designed to allow women to labour in an upright position, were often elaborately carved with protective symbols and religious imagery. While the upright position was actually beneficial for many women in labor, the rigid adherence to traditional positioning sometimes made the stools less effective than they might have been. The herbs that would be burned during labor were selected not only for their supposed medical properties, but also for their ability to purify the spiritual atmosphere of the birthing chamber. Frankincense and myrrh were expensive, but highly prized for their associations with the birth of Christ. More common herbs like rosemary, thyme, and lavender were believed to provide protection against evil influences, while also supposedly easing the pains of labor. The selection of birth attendants became increasingly crucial as Eleanor's due date approached. The lead midwife, whose skill and experience could literally determine whether Eleanor lived or died, would be chosen with enormous care. Families would investigate not only her success rate and reputation, but also her religious beliefs, her relationships with other women in the community, and even her personal history for any factors that might bring bad luck to the birth. Supporting midwives and female relatives would be chosen based on a complex set of criteria that included their own experiences with childbirth, their knowledge of herbal remedies, and their ability to remain calm under pressure. Each woman attending the birth would have specific responsibilities, from preparing herbal treatments to offering prayers and emotional support. The coordination of these various roles required careful planning and clear communication, as any confusion during labor could have fatal consequences. The foods that would be available during Eleanor's labor were prepared according to recipes that had been passed down through generations of women. These weren't simply nutritious meals designed to maintain her strength, but rather carefully crafted preparations that were believed to have specific effects on the progress of labor. Some foods were thought to speed delivery, while others were supposed to ease pain or prevent complications. Broths made from specific combinations of herbs and meats were considered essential for maintaining the mother's strength during what could be a prolonged ordeal. The ingredients for these broths were selected based on humoral theory, with hot and moist foods preferred for their supposed ability to maintain the proper balance of bodily fluids during birth. The preparation of these foods often began days before labor was expected to start, as some recipes required lengthy cooking times or complex processes of extraction and concentration. Wine, considered essential for its supposed ability to ease pain and provide strength, would be prepared with various herbal additives believed to enhance its beneficial properties. Some midwives added ground pearls or gold dust to the wine, while others preferred specific combinations of herbs that were thought to have protective or strengthening effects. The quality and type of wine used was considered crucial, with families often reserving their best vintages for the birthing chamber. The prayers and incantations that would accompany Eleanor's labor represented a fusion of Christian orthodoxy and much older pagan traditions that had been adapted and absorbed into medieval religious practice. Specific psalms were recited at particular moments during labor, while ancient charms and protective formulas were whispered by the midwives as they worked. This blending of official religious practice with folk magic reflected the desperate desire to use every possible resource in the fight against the very real dangers of childbirth. The timing of these prayers was considered crucial, with different invocations appropriate for different stages of labor. The beginning of contractions called for prayers requesting divine protection and strength, while the actual delivery required more urgent appeals for immediate assistance. Even after the child was born, specific prayers were needed to ensure the safe delivery of the afterbirth and the mother's survival of the dangerous hours immediately following birth. The physical preparations for managing the birth itself were limited by medieval medicine's fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy and the birth process. Midwives worked with crude instruments and relied heavily on techniques that had been passed down through generations of women, some of which were helpful, while others were actively harmful. The absence of any real understanding of infection control meant that instruments and birthing areas were rarely properly sanitized, increasing the risk of the deadly infections that claimed so many new mothers. The positioning of the laboring woman was dictated by tradition and superstition rather than medical knowledge of what might actually facilitate delivery. Some midwives insisted that women should remain upright throughout labor, while others preferred that they lie down during the final stages of birth. The birthing stool, when available, offered a compromise that allowed for upright positioning while providing some support. But the rigid adherence to traditional positioning sometimes prevented midwives from adapting their approach to the specific needs of individual women. As Eleanor's 9th month arrived, bringing with it the final countdown to her ordeal, the atmosphere in her household would become increasingly tense. Everyone understood that the approaching birth represented not just the arrival of a new family member, but potentially the death of the woman they had all come to depend upon. The preparations that had been months in the making would now be finalized. The birth attendants would be placed on alert, and Eleanor herself would enter the final phase of a journey that had begun 9 months earlier with hope and anticipation, but now approached its climax with fear and desperate prayer. The sounds that would soon fill the birthing chamber, the cries of pain and effort, the urgent whispers of midwives, the fervent prayers of attendants, all represented humanity's ancient struggle against the forces that threatened to claim both mother and child in the moment of birth itself. For Eleanor, like countless women before her, the approaching labor represented the ultimate test of courage, endurance, and faith in a world where bringing new life into existence remained the most dangerous thing a woman could do. In the flickering candlelight of her sealed chamber, surrounded by the elaborate preparations that medieval society believed necessary for safe delivery, Eleanor would soon face an ordeal that would determine not only whether her child would live, but whether she herself would survive to hold the baby she had carried for so many months of fear, hope, and desperate preparation. The first labor pains that seized Eleanor's body came not with the dramatic urgency of modern birthing stories, but with a slow, creeping dread that had been building for weeks. Unlike today's expectant mothers who might time contractions with smartphone apps and rush to sterile hospital rooms, Eleanor's labor began in a world where pain was expected, medical intervention was primitive, and death lurked behind every contraction like an unwelcome guest at a feast. The early signs of labor were interpreted through a lens of superstition and medical ignorance that would seem almost comical if the consequences weren't so deadly. The wise women attending Eleanor would examine the timing of her pains, their intensity, and even their location on her body, all in service of predictions that had no basis in anatomical reality. Some claimed they could determine how long her labor would last by the phase of the moon, while others insisted that the direction of the wind outside her chamber would influence whether her child would be born alive. As Eleanor's contractions intensified, the birthing chamber would transform from a place of preparation into a theatre of medieval medical practice at its most primitive and dangerous. The midwives would spring into action with treatments that range from the merely useless to the actively harmful, all performed with the confident authority of women who believed they understood forces they could barely comprehend. The pain relief available to medieval women in labor was virtually non-existent, and what little existed was often forbidden by religious doctrine. The Church taught that the agony of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, and that women who sought to ease their suffering were defying divine will. This meant that Eleanor would be expected to endure hours or even days of excruciating pain with nothing more than herbal remedies that provided minimal comfort at best. The herbal preparations used during medieval labor were a mixture of genuine folk wisdom and dangerous experimentation. Some midwives would give laboring women ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and can indeed strengthen contractions, but which could also cause violent convulsions, hallucinations, and death if administered in the wrong dose. Others prescribed preparations made from various plants and minerals that had no medical value whatsoever, but were believed to possess magical properties that could ease delivery. The physical techniques employed by medieval midwives were equally problematic. Without any understanding of sterile procedure, they would examine laboring women with unwashed hands, potentially introducing deadly infections into the birth canal. Their knowledge of anatomy was so limited that they often couldn't determine whether a child was positioned correctly for delivery. leading to prolonged labours that exhausted both mother and baby. The birthing positions recommended by medieval midwives were dictated more by tradition and superstition than by any understanding of what might actually facilitate delivery. Some insisted that women should walk continuously during early labour, believing that movement would help the child find its way out of the womb. Others required that labouring women remain in specific positions that were supposed to align their bodies with favourable spiritual forces, even when these positions made delivery more difficult. The birthing stool, when available, represented one of the few genuinely helpful innovations in medieval obstetric care. These specially designed seats allowed women to labour in an upright position, using gravity to assist in delivery while providing support during the long hours of contractions. However, even this useful tool was often employed incorrectly, with rigid adherence to traditional positioning, sometimes preventing midwives from adapting to the specific needs of individual labours. The monitoring of labour progress in medieval times was based on observation and guesswork rather than any scientific understanding of the birth process. Midwives would feel the labouring woman's belly, trying to determine the position of the child and the strength of contractions, but their interpretations were filtered through theories about bodily humours and spiritual influences that bore no resemblance to medical reality. They might conclude that labour was progressing too slowly because the woman hadn't prayed hard enough, or too quickly because she had been exposed to excessive heat during pregnancy. The duration of medieval labour was often prolonged far beyond what we would consider normal today, sometimes lasting for days as exhausted women struggled to deliver children who couldn't be born naturally. Without the surgical interventions that can save lives in complicated deliveries, midwives could only wait and hope, offering increasingly desperate remedies as mothers and babies weakened from the prolonged ordeal. The moment of actual delivery brought its own set of medieval horrors. Midwives worked in the dim, flickering light of candles and oil lamps, trying to guide children into the world while operating in near darkness. The sealed birthing chamber, which medieval medicine considered essential for protection against corrupting influences, created an airless, stifling environment that made the already difficult work of delivery even more challenging. The tools available to medieval midwives were crude and often dangerous. Sharp instruments that might be used to assist in difficult deliveries were rarely cleaned properly, increasing the risk of infection. The forceps that could save lives in obstructed labours wouldn't be invented for centuries, leaving midwives to rely on their hands alone to guide babies through the birth canal. When intervention was necessary, it was often brutal and frequently fatal for both mother and child. The immediate aftermath of delivery was just as perilous as the birth itself. Medieval midwives had no understanding of the importance of delivering the placenta completely, sometimes leaving fragments behind that could cause deadly infections. They lacked knowledge of how to control postpartum bleeding, one of the leading causes of maternal death, often resorting to treatments that made hemorrhaging worse rather than better. The care of newborn babies in the moments after birth was guided by the same mixture of ignorance and superstition that characterized all medieval medical practice. Infants might be immediately plunged into cold water, believing this would strengthen them, or subjected to various procedures designed to clear their airways that could actually cause harm. The umbilical cord was cut with instruments that were rarely sterile, creating another opportunity for life-threatening infection. The spiritual rituals that accompanied medieval birth were considered just as important as any medical intervention, if not more so. Specific prayers would be recited at crucial moments during labour, holy relics would be touched to the labouring woman's body, and blessed objects would be placed around the birthing chamber in patterns that were supposed to channel divine protection toward mother and child. The community of women attending the birth would maintain a constant vigil of prayer and encouragement, sharing stories of successful deliveries while carefully avoiding mention of the many women who had died in similar circumstances. Their emotional support was perhaps the most valuable service they provided, offering comfort and companionship during an ordeal that could last for days. The food and drink provided to laboring women reflected the same blend of practical wisdom and medical ignorance that characterized medieval pregnancy care. Eleanor might be offered broths designed to maintain her strength, but she could also be encouraged to consume preparations that were supposed to speed her labor, but might actually cause complications. Some midwives insisted that laboring women should fast to make delivery easier, while others provided specific foods thought to have magical properties. The social dynamics of the birthing chamber created a unique environment where normal hierarchies were temporarily suspended in favor of the shared goal of bringing mother and child safely through the ordeal of birth. Wealthy women labored alongside their servants, with class distinctions temporarily forgotten in the face of the universal dangers that threatened all women in childbirth. The sounds that filled the medieval birthing chamber during active labor created a symphony of human suffering that modern ears would find difficult to comprehend. Eleanor's cries of pain would be joined by the urgent whispers of midwives, the fervent prayers of attendants, and the crackling of fires that were kept burning throughout the labor to provide warmth and light in the sealed chamber. The smells of the birthing chamber were equally overwhelming, combining the natural odors of labor and delivery with the smoke of burning herbs, the scent of religious incense, and the mustiness of the sealed room where fresh air was forbidden entry. These sensory experiences created an atmosphere that was both sacred and terrifying, reflecting the medieval understanding of birth as a mystical process that existed at the boundary between life and death. The exhaustion that accompanied prolonged medieval labor was unlike anything modern women experienced during delivery. Without proper nutrition, adequate rest, or effective pain relief, women like Eleanor would labor for days in increasingly weakened states, their bodies pushed far beyond normal endurance in the desperate hope of successfully delivering their children. The moments of crisis that inevitably arose during difficult medieval births brought out both the best and worst in the attending women. Faced with complications they couldn't understand or treat effectively, midwives might resort to increasingly desperate measures, from violent manipulations of the laboring woman's body to the administration of dangerous herbal preparations that could cause more harm than good. The decision-making process during complicated medieval births was hampered by the absence of male physicians, who were generally excluded from the birthing chamber, and the limited knowledge of the female attendants who remained. Important choices about whether to attempt dangerous interventions or when to give up hope for the mother's survival were made by women whose medical training consisted entirely of accumulated folklore and personal experience. The prayers that filled the birthing chamber during the most dangerous moments of labor reflected the desperate faith of medieval people who understood that human knowledge and skill could only go so far in the face of the mysteries of birth and death. Specific saints were invoked for their supposed power to protect women in childbirth, while ancient charms and protective formulas were whispered by midwives who hoped that spiritual intervention might succeed where medical knowledge had failed. As Eleanor's labor progressed through its dangerous stages, moving inexorably toward the moment when she would either triumph over the forces that threatened her life or join the countless women who had died in similar circumstances, the atmosphere in the birthing chamber would become increasingly tense. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing one of humanity's oldest dramas, the eternal struggle between life and death that played out in birthing chambers across medieval Europe with tragic regularity. The approaching climax of Eleanor's labor would test not only her own strength and endurance, but also the skills and knowledge of the women attending her, the efficacy of the prayers being offered on her behalf, and the willingness of fate itself to allow both mother and child to survive an ordeal that claimed far too many lives in a world where bringing new life into existence remained humanity's most dangerous endeavor. The climactic moment of medieval birth arrived not with the controlled efficiency of modern delivery rooms, but with a primal intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sealed chamber. As Eleanor's body prepared for the final stage of its 9-month ordeal, the midwives would gather closer, their faces grim with the knowledge that the next few hours would determine whether this story ended in celebration or tragedy. The actual delivery in medieval times was a brutal affair that bore little resemblance to our modern understanding of safe childbirth. The midwives, working by the dim light of flickering candles, would position themselves around Eleanor's labouring body with the careful precision of generals preparing for battle. Their hands, unwashed and potentially carrying infection from previous births, would guide and manipulate as best they could, operating more on intuition and tradition than any genuine medical knowledge. The pushing stage of medieval labour was particularly harrowing because midwives had no real understanding of when or how a woman should exert herself during delivery. Some insisted that labouring women should push constantly once contractions began, exhausting themselves in futile efforts that could last for hours. Others believed that pushing too early could harm the child, leading to delays that prolonged suffering unnecessarily and increased the risk of complications for both mother and baby. The position Eleanor would assume for the actual birth depended entirely on the preferences and traditions of her attending midwives. Some insisted that women should remain upright on birthing stools throughout delivery, believing that gravity would assist in bringing the child into the world. Others preferred that labouring women lie on their sides or backs, positions that were often less effective, but were considered spiritually appropriate, according to various folk beliefs and religious interpretations. The moment when Eleanor's child finally began to emerge from her body would be met with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety from the attending women. Medieval midwives understood that the appearance of the baby's head was no guarantee of a successful delivery, as they had witnessed too many births where complications at this crucial stage led to the death of mother, child, or both. Their techniques for assisting delivery were crude and often dangerous, relying on physical manipulation that could cause tearing, infection, or other serious injuries. The cutting of the umbilical cord in medieval times was performed with whatever sharp instrument was available, often a knife or scissors that had seen use for other household purposes and were rarely cleaned properly. The midwives had no understanding of sterile technique, and the risk of introducing deadly infection at this critical moment was enormous. The length at which the cord was cut, the method of tying it off, and even the timing of the cutting were all subject to superstitious beliefs that often had no basis in medical reality. The immediate care of the newborn infant reflected the same mixture of practical wisdom and dangerous ignorance that characterized all aspects of medieval medical practice. Some midwives would immediately clear the baby's airways using techniques that were genuinely helpful, while others might subject the infant to procedures that were unnecessary or actively harmful. The practice of immediately bathing newborns in cold water, believed to strengthen them for the harsh realities of medieval life, actually increased the risk of hypothermia and shock in babies who were already vulnerable from the trauma of birth. The examination of the newborn for signs of health or deformity was conducted according to medieval theories about child development that bore no resemblance to modern medical knowledge. Midwives would look for specific physical characteristics that were supposed to indicate the child's future health, intelligence, or even moral character. Birthmarks were interpreted as omens. The shape of the baby's head was analysed for signs of intelligence, and even the infant's first cries were subjected to interpretation for clues about its future temperament. The delivery of the placenta, known in medieval times as the afterbirth, was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire birth process, though the attending women rarely understood why. Medieval midwives had no knowledge of the importance of ensuring that the placenta was delivered completely and intact, sometimes leaving fragments behind that could cause deadly infections in the days following birth. Their techniques for assisting placental delivery were often violent and counterproductive, increasing rather than decreasing the risk of hemorrhage and other complications. The immediate postpartum period was fraught with dangers that medieval medicine was powerless to address effectively. Postpartum hemorrhage, one of the leading causes of maternal death, was treated with remedies that ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. Some midwives would pack the birth canal with herbs or other materials, believing this would stop bleeding, but actually increasing the risk of infection. Others would administer powerful herbal preparations that were supposed to contract the uterus, but often caused violent convulsions or other dangerous side effects. The signs of postpartum infection, which claimed the lives of countless new mothers in the days and weeks following delivery, were poorly understood by medieval caregivers. The fever, pain, and other symptoms that indicated the presence of deadly bacteria were often attributed to spiritual causes or imbalances in the bodily humours, leading to treatments that made the infection worse rather than better. Bloodletting, considered a cure-all for many medieval ailments, was particularly dangerous for women who had already lost blood during delivery and needed every drop to recover from the ordeal of birth. The emotional aftermath of medieval birth was complicated by the high rates of infant and maternal mortality that made celebration a tentative affair at best. Even when both mother and child survived the immediate dangers of delivery, everyone present understood that the weeks and months ahead would continue to pose serious threats to their survival. The joy of successful birth was always tempered by the knowledge that so many apparently healthy babies died in their first months of life, and that new mothers remained vulnerable to infections and complications that could claim their lives weeks after delivery. The spiritual significance of successful birth in medieval culture was enormous, representing not just the continuation of family lines, but also divine approval of the parents and their community. The prayers of thanksgiving that followed safe delivery were as fervent as the pleas for protection that had accompanied labour, reflecting the medieval understanding that survival was a gift from God rather than the result of medical skill or knowledge. The naming of the child, if it survived the immediate dangers of birth, was often delayed for days or even weeks until it became clear that the infant would live long enough to make baptism worthwhile. This practical approach to infant mortality reflected the harsh realities of medieval life, where parents learned not to become too attached to babies who might not survive their first months. The ceremonies surrounding baptism were as much about ensuring the child's spiritual safety as celebrating its physical survival. The recovery period for new mothers in medieval times was both more extended and more dangerous than modern postpartum care. Women who had survived the ordeal of birth were expected to remain confined to their chambers for weeks, not because they were being pampered, but because medieval medicine recognized that the period following delivery was particularly dangerous for new mothers. However, the treatments prescribed for postpartum recovery were often counterproductive, including continued bloodletting, restrictive diets, and herbal preparations that could interfere with healing. The support network that surrounded new mothers during their recovery period was entirely female, as men were excluded from the intimate details of postpartum care, just as they had been from the birth itself. The women who attended new mothers during recovery brought with them generations of accumulated wisdom about caring for women who had survived childbirth. But this knowledge was mixed with superstitions and misconceptions that sometimes did more harm than good. The feeding of newborn infants in medieval times was subject to the same mixture of practical wisdom and dangerous ignorance that characterized all aspects of childcare. Breastfeeding was generally preferred when possible, but medieval theories about breast milk were so fundamentally flawed that the advice given to nursing mothers often interfered with successful lactation. Some believed that a mother's emotions could poison her milk, while others insisted that certain foods or activities could make breast milk harmful to infants. The wet nursing industry that developed around wealthy families who could afford to hire other women to feed their babies was fraught with its own dangers and complications. The selection of wet nurses was based on theories about how a woman's character and health could be transmitted through her milk, leading to elaborate screening processes that had no basis in medical reality. The wet nurses themselves were often women who had lost their own babies and were forced by economic necessity to sell their services to families who could afford to pay for infant feeding. The swaddling practices used for medieval newborns reflected beliefs about child development that seem bizarre by modern standards. Infants were wrapped tightly in strips of cloth that were supposed to encourage proper growth and prevent deformities, but which actually restricted movement and could interfere with healthy development. The cloths used for swaddling were rarely washed properly, creating additional opportunities for infection and skin problems in babies whose immune systems were already compromised by the conditions of their birth. The mortality rates for both mothers and infants in medieval times were so high that successful birth and survival through the first months of life represented genuine triumphs against overwhelming odds. The women who lived through the experience of medieval childbirth carried with them not only the physical scars of their ordeal, but also the psychological impact of having survived something that claimed the lives of so many others. This combination of trauma and triumph shaped medieval women's understanding of their own bodies and their relationships with the children they had risked everything to bring into the world. The economic impact of childbirth on medieval families extended far beyond the immediate costs of hiring midwives and purchasing supplies for the birthing chamber. The loss of the mother's labor during pregnancy, birth, and recovery represented a significant burden for families who depended on every member's contribution for survival. When mothers died in childbirth, the economic consequences could be devastating, leaving families without essential skills and labor, while adding the burden of caring for motherless infants. The social rituals that surrounded successful medieval birth served important functions in reinforcing community bonds and providing support networks for new families. The celebrations that followed safe delivery were opportunities for the community to come together in gratitude and relief, sharing food, stories, and advice, while strengthening the relationships that would be crucial for the family's future survival and prosperity. The long-term health consequences of medieval childbirth affected women throughout their reproductive years and beyond. The physical damage caused by repeated pregnancies and deliveries, combined with the lack of proper medical care, meant that many women suffered from chronic pain, disability, and other health problems that significantly impacted their quality of life. The average medieval woman who survived to menopause had endured multiple pregnancies and births, each one taking a toll on her body that accumulated over time. The knowledge passed down from mother to daughter about pregnancy and childbirth represented one of the few areas where women maintained some degree of autonomy and expertise in medieval society. This female-centered tradition of birth knowledge, while often mixed with superstition and misinformation, also contained genuine wisdom about managing pregnancy, labor, and infant care that had been accumulated over generations of women's experiences. As Eleanor's story drew toward its conclusion, whether in triumph or tragedy, it represented just one thread in the vast tapestry of medieval women's experiences with pregnancy and childbirth. Her individual struggle against the forces that threatened her life and that of her child was repeated countless times throughout medieval Europe. Each birth, a small drama that tested the limits of human endurance and the power of hope to sustain people through their darkest hours. The legacy of medieval childbirth extends far beyond the historical record of mortality rates and medical practices. It reminds us of the extraordinary courage displayed by women who faced almost certain death in order to continue the human story, and of the gradual accumulation of knowledge and technique that eventually made childbirth safer for future generations. Every modern mother who delivers safely in a sterile hospital room owes a debt to the medieval women who endured unimaginable dangers to bring life into a world that offered them so little protection in return. The weeks following childbirth in medieval times brought a new set of terrors that modern mothers could scarcely imagine. If Eleanor had survived the ordeal of delivery, she now faced what many considered an equally dangerous period of recovery, where death could still claim her through infections, complications, or the simple exhaustion of a body pushed beyond its limits by months of inadequate care and primitive medical understanding. The concept of postpartum care in medieval Europe was governed by the same mixture of superstition, religious doctrine, and medical ignorance that had characterized Eleanor's entire pregnancy. The women who had attended her birth would continue their vigil for days or even weeks, watching for signs of the complications that claimed so many new mothers just when their families thought the danger had passed. These signs were interpreted through the lens of humoral theory and spiritual beliefs that bore no resemblance to our modern understanding of postpartum health. Eleanor would be confined to her chamber for a period that could last anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on her family's social status and the opinions of her caregivers. This confinement, known as lying in, was considered essential for her recovery, but the treatments prescribed during this period often did more harm than good. She might be subjected to continued bloodletting to balance her humours, fed a restrictive diet based on medieval theories about which foods were safe for new mothers, and given herbal preparations that could interfere with her body's natural healing processes. The birthing chamber, which had been sealed and darkened for delivery, would remain Eleanor's prison during her recovery. Fresh air was still considered dangerous, keeping her in the same stuffy, airless environment that had made labour more difficult. The lack of sunlight and proper ventilation created conditions that were ideal for the growth of bacteria and other pathogens, increasing rather than decreasing her risk of developing the infections that killed so many new mothers. The signs of puerperal fever, the deadly infection that claimed countless women in the days and weeks following childbirth, were poorly understood by medieval caregivers. When Eleanor developed a fever, as many new mothers did, it would be attributed to an excess of hot humours rather than bacterial infection. The treatments prescribed for this condition were often counterproductive, including more bloodletting at a time when her body desperately needed to retain its strength, and the administration of heating herbs that could raise her body temperature even higher. The care of Eleanor's newborn infant, assuming it had survived the trauma of medieval delivery, was subject to the same blend of folk wisdom and dangerous ignorance that characterized all aspects of medieval childcare. The baby would be swaddled tightly in strips of cloth that were rarely washed properly, creating a breeding ground for bacteria and preventing the natural movement that is essential for healthy development. The swaddling was believed to encourage proper growth and prevent deformities, but in reality, it often caused skin problems and interfered with the infant's ability to develop normally. Feeding the newborn presented its own set of challenges and dangers. If Eleanor was able to breastfeed, she would receive advice based on medieval theories about breast milk that were so fundamentally wrong they sometimes interfered with successful nursing. She might be told that her emotions could poison her milk, that certain foods would make it harmful to her child, or that feeding at specific times of day was dangerous. These beliefs could lead to feeding schedules that didn't meet the infant's needs and increase the risk of failure to thrive. If Eleanor was unable to breastfeed, or if she died in childbirth as so many women did, the alternatives available for infant feeding were limited and often dangerous. Wet nurses, when they could be found and afforded, were selected based on medieval theories about how a woman's character and health could be transmitted through her milk. The screening process for wet nurses involved examining everything from their moral reputation to the colour of their hair, none of which had any bearing on their ability to provide safe, nutritious milk for infants. For families who couldn't afford wet nurses, artificial feeding methods were primitive and often fatal for babies. Animal milk, when available, was given without any understanding of the need for sterilization or proper preparation. Pap, a mixture of bread and water or milk, was often fed to infants who were too young to digest solid foods properly. These feeding methods resulted in high rates of infant mortality from malnutrition, digestive problems, and infections that could have been prevented with proper knowledge and care. The baptism of surviving infants was often rushed, not out of religious enthusiasm, but from the practical understanding that many babies didn't live long enough to make elaborate ceremonies worthwhile. The timing of baptism was carefully calculated to balance the spiritual need to ensure the child's salvation against the practical reality that premature celebration might be followed quickly by grief. Families learned to temper their joy at successful births with the knowledge that infant mortality rates were so high that survival through the first months of life was far from guaranteed. The economic burden of childbirth extended far beyond the immediate costs of hiring midwives and purchasing supplies for the birthing chamber. Eleanor's family would face weeks or months of reduced productivity as she recovered from her ordeal, assuming she survived it. The care required for both mother and infant during the postpartum period placed additional demands on family resources at a time when the household could least afford to lose essential labor and income. The psychological impact of medieval childbirth affected not only the women who survived it, but also their families and communities. The constant awareness that pregnancy and birth were likely to result in death created a climate of anxiety that colored every aspect of reproductive life. Women who had successfully given birth once knew that each subsequent pregnancy brought the same terrible odds, making the decision to have more children a calculation that weighed the desire for offspring against the very real possibility of death. The superstitions and rituals that surrounded the postpartum period were as elaborate and numerous as those that had governed pregnancy and birth. Eleanor would be advised about which foods to eat, how to position herself during recovery, and what activities were safe during her confinement. Some of these beliefs were harmless, while others could actually interfere with her recovery. The prohibition against fresh air and sunlight, for example, deprived new mothers of the vitamin D and improved circulation that might have helped them heal more quickly. The gradual return to normal activities following medieval childbirth was governed by religious and social customs that often bore no relationship to the woman's actual physical condition. The ceremony of churching, which marked the end of a new mother's ritual impurity and her readmission to normal social and religious life, was timed according to biblical precedent rather than medical need. This ceremony served important social functions, but it also reinforced the medieval view of childbirth as spiritually contaminating rather than naturally healthy. The long-term health consequences of medieval pregnancy and childbirth affected women throughout their reproductive years and beyond. The physical damage caused by repeated pregnancies without proper medical care, combined with the poor nutrition and harsh living conditions that characterized medieval life, meant that many women suffered from chronic health problems that significantly reduced their quality of life. Prolapsed uteruses, damaged pelvic floors, and other complications from difficult births were common and untreatable, leaving women to cope with pain and disability for the rest of their lives. The knowledge that women accumulated through their experiences with pregnancy and childbirth was passed down through generations in an informal network of female wisdom that existed parallel to official medical practice. This tradition of women's knowledge contained both valuable insights gained through practical experience and dangerous misconceptions that could harm mothers and babies. The mixture of helpful and harmful information reflected the desperate attempts of medieval women to understand and control reproductive processes that were largely beyond their comprehension. The social support networks that developed around childbirth served crucial functions in helping women survive the dangers of medieval pregnancy and birth. The community of women who attended births, provided postpartum care, and shared their knowledge with younger generations created bonds that were essential for survival in a world where official medical care was inadequate or non-existent. These networks provided emotional support, practical assistance, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had faced similar challenges. The religious dimension of medieval childbirth recovery was as important as any medical treatment in the minds of most people. Prayers of thanksgiving for survival were balanced by continued appeals for protection during the vulnerable weeks following birth. The spiritual significance of surviving childbirth was enormous, representing divine favor and blessing on the family. Churches developed special services and prayers for new mothers, recognizing both the spiritual importance of successful birth and the ongoing need for divine protection during recovery. The seasonal timing of births added another layer of challenge to postpartum recovery in medieval times. Babies born during harsh winter months faced additional risks, as did mothers who had to recover in cold, poorly heated chambers. Summer births brought different challenges, as the sealed birthing chambers became stifling hot, and the risk of food spoilage increased the danger of illness for both mother and child. The agricultural calendar also affected the availability of family members to provide care, as busy seasons left fewer people available to attend to the needs of new mothers and infants. The class differences in postpartum care were stark in medieval society. Wealthy women might have access to multiple attendants, better food, and more comfortable accommodations during their recovery, while poor women often had to return to work within days of giving birth, regardless of their physical condition. The mortality rates varied significantly between social classes, reflecting not only the quality of care available, but also the general health and nutrition of women from different backgrounds. The medical treatments available during postpartum recovery were limited and often based on theories that had no scientific foundation. Herbal remedies were the mainstay of postpartum care, with different plants prescribed for various conditions and complications. Some of these remedies had genuine medicinal properties, while others were useless or actively harmful. The dosages and preparation methods were often inconsistent, and the quality of herbs could vary dramatically depending on their source and storage conditions. The transition from the intense, female-centered environment of childbirth to the normal patterns of medieval family life was often abrupt and difficult for new mothers. The support and attention that had surrounded them during labor and immediate recovery would gradually fade as life returned to its usual rhythms. Women who had been the center of concern and care during their confinement might find themselves quickly expected to resume their normal duties and responsibilities, regardless of their physical or emotional readiness. The impact of high infant mortality rates on medieval families created a complex emotional landscape around childbirth and early parenthood. Parents learned to balance love and attachment for their children with the practical understanding that many babies wouldn't survive to adulthood. This didn't mean they cared less for their children, but rather that they developed coping strategies for dealing with loss that might seem cold or detached by modern standards. The development of midwifery as a recognized profession during the medieval period represented one of the few areas where women could achieve some degree of professional status and economic independence. Skilled midwives were valued members of their communities, called upon not only for births, but also for other medical needs related to women's health. However, their practice was increasingly regulated by male-dominated medical and religious authorities, who sought to control and limit women's traditional roles in healthcare. The gradual accumulation of knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth during the medieval period laid the groundwork for future improvements in maternal and infant care. While much of medieval obstetric practice was harmful or useless, some techniques and observations represented genuine advances in understanding. The careful documentation of symptoms and outcomes by some practitioners provided valuable information that would eventually contribute to better medical care for pregnant and laboring women. The stories of individual women like Eleanor, multiplied across countless families throughout medieval Europe, remind us of the extraordinary courage required to face pregnancy and childbirth in an era when these natural processes were more likely to result in death than life. Their experiences, preserved in fragmentary records and oral traditions, bear witness to both the dangers they faced and the remarkable resilience they displayed in the face of odds that would seem impossible to overcome. As we reflect on the world of medieval pregnancy and childbirth, we're reminded not only of how far medical knowledge has advanced, but also of the debt we owe to the women who survived these ordeals to continue the human story. Every modern birth that ends safely represents the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge and improved care, built on the experiences of countless women who faced far greater dangers with far less support than we can imagine. The legacy of medieval childbirth extends beyond medical history to encompass questions of women's autonomy, social support, and the value placed on female lives and experiences. The gradual improvement in maternal and infant outcomes over the centuries reflects not only advances in medical knowledge, but also changing attitudes about women's worth and the importance of preserving their lives and health. Tonight, as you settle into peaceful rest, spare a thought for Eleanor and the countless women like her who faced the greatest challenge of their lives with nothing but courage, hope, and the support of other women who understood that in medieval times, bringing new life into the world required a heroism that history has too often forgotten. Their stories remind us that the miracle of birth has always required not just biological processes, but human bravery, community support, and the kind of strength that emerges when people face impossible odds with nothing but love and determination to guide them through the darkness. In the hushed hours before dawn, when the medieval world lay wrapped in darkness and uncertainty, Eleanor's story reached its quiet conclusion. Whether she joined the countless women who had perished in childbed, or numbered among the fortunate few who survived to hold their babies, her journey through pregnancy in the 14th century had ended as it began, surrounded by mystery, superstition, and the whispered prayers of women who understood that bringing life into their world was an act of extraordinary courage. The aftermath of medieval birth rippled outward through families and communities like stones cast into still water. If Eleanor had survived, she would carry the physical and emotional scars of her ordeal for the rest of her life, joining the ranks of women whose bodies bore the permanent marks of medieval childbirth. The tears that couldn't be properly repaired, the infections that never fully healed, the chronic pain that would accompany her through years of additional pregnancies, all served as daily reminders of what she had endured. The medical understanding of postpartum complications was so primitive that many women suffered in silence from conditions that modern medicine could easily treat. Prolapsed organs, damaged muscles, and internal injuries were accepted as inevitable consequences of childbirth, part of the price that medieval women paid for fulfilling their primary function in society. These injuries weren't discussed openly, hidden away like shameful secrets in a world that had no vocabulary for women's physical suffering beyond the context of divine punishment. The psychological impact of surviving medieval childbirth was equally profound, but even less understood by the society that had subjected women to such ordeals. The trauma of prolonged labor, the terror of facing likely death, and the guilt of surviving when so many others didn't created emotional wounds that had no recognized treatment. Medieval women were expected to be grateful for their survival and to quickly resume their roles as wives, mothers, and household managers, regardless of their inner struggles with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The community of women who had attended Eleanor's birth would disperse back to their own lives, carrying with them the knowledge gained from another encounter with the mysterious forces that governed life and death. Some would file away new observations about herbal remedies or positioning techniques, adding to the collective wisdom that would be passed down to future generations. Others would remember only the fear and uncertainty, the desperate prayers and whispered reassurances that had filled the birthing chamber during its darkest hours. The infant, if it had survived the trauma of medieval delivery, would begin its own precarious journey through a world that offered little protection for the youngest and most vulnerable. The first weeks of life were as dangerous as the birth itself, with infection, malnutrition, and simple accidents claiming babies who had managed to survive the ordeal of coming into existence. Medieval parents learned not to name their children immediately, waiting weeks or even months to see if the baby would live long enough to make formal recognition worthwhile. The wet nurses who cared for infants whose mothers had died in childbirth faced their own complex emotional landscape. These women, often having lost their own babies, would form attachments to the children they fed, while knowing that their services might be terminated at any moment if better arrangements could be made. The milk they provided was literally their livelihood, sold to families who could afford to pay, while their own emotional needs went unrecognized and unmet. The economic calculations that surrounded medieval childbirth were as cold as they were necessary. Families had to weigh the cost of hiring skilled midwives against the potential loss of the mother's labour and skills. The expense of postpartum care, special foods and recovery time had to be balanced against the family's ability to survive without essential income. These practical considerations often meant that poor women received minimal care during and after birth, contributing to the higher mortality rates among the lower classes. The seasonal patterns of medieval life added another layer of complexity to the timing and outcome of pregnancies. Women who gave birth during harvest time might find themselves with minimal care, as family members were occupied with the critical work of gathering crops. Winter births brought their own challenges, as cold chambers and limited food supplies created additional risks for both mothers and infants. The agricultural calendar that governed medieval life showed little consideration for the biological realities of human reproduction. The religious ceremonies that marked successful births were as much about community celebration as individual blessing. The churching ceremony that would eventually welcome a surviving mother back into full participation in religious life served to reintegrate her into society while acknowledging the spiritual significance of her ordeal. These rituals provided structure and meaning to experiences that were otherwise largely beyond human understanding or control. The accumulation of birth stories within medieval communities created a complex oral tradition that served both to educate and to terrify young women approaching their own reproductive years. The tales of successful deliveries were balanced by equally vivid accounts of women who had died in agony, creating a narrative tradition that prepared girls for the realities they would face while also instilling the fear that would accompany them into their own birthing chambers. The development of patron saints specifically associated with childbirth reflected the desperate need for divine intervention in a process that human knowledge could barely influence. Saint Margaret, Saint Anne, and others became the focus of intense devotion from pregnant women who understood that prayer might be their most effective protection against the dangers ahead. The shrines dedicated to these saints became pilgrimage destinations for women seeking supernatural assistance with their pregnancies. The gradual evolution of midwifery practices during the medieval period represented one of the few areas where women's knowledge and expertise were formally recognized and valued. Skilled midwives developed reputations that extended far beyond their immediate communities, called upon by wealthy families who could afford to pay for the best available care. However, this recognition came with increasing regulation and oversight from male-dominated medical and religious authorities, who sought to control and limit traditional women's roles in healthcare. The herbal knowledge that formed the backbone of medieval obstetric care was passed down through generations of women who had learned through trial and error which plants might help and which could harm. This botanical wisdom represented centuries of accumulated observation and experimentation, though it was mixed with superstitions and misconceptions that could be dangerous. The preparation and administration of herbal remedies required skills that were acquired through long apprenticeships and careful attention to the experiences of other practitioners. The instruments used by medieval midwives were crude by modern standards, but represented the best technology available for assisting difficult births. The birthing stools, forceps-like devices, and other tools were often passed down through generations of midwives, each adding her own modifications and improvements based on experience. The maintenance and proper use of these instruments required knowledge that was closely guarded within the midwifery community. The training of new midwives was an informal process that relied heavily on apprenticeship and observation rather than formal education. Young women who showed aptitude for the work would be taken on by experienced practitioners, learning through hands-on experience with actual births. This training system ensured that practical knowledge was preserved and transmitted, but it also meant that dangerous practices and misconceptions were equally likely to be passed down to future generations. The social status of midwives within medieval communities was complex and sometimes contradictory. While they were respected for their skills and called upon in moments of crisis, they were also viewed with suspicion due to their association with the mysterious and dangerous processes of birth and death. The line between healing and witchcraft was often thin in medieval minds, and midwives could find themselves accused of causing the very problems they were trying to solve. The record-keeping practices of medieval midwives, when they existed at all, were limited and often focused more on spiritual outcomes than medical details. The success or failure of births was frequently attributed to divine will rather than medical skill, making it difficult to identify patterns or develop improved techniques. The lack of systematic documentation meant that valuable knowledge was often lost when experienced practitioners died without passing on their insights to the next generation. The influence of astrological beliefs on medieval childbirth added another layer of complexity to an already difficult process. The timing of births was thought to be influenced by planetary alignments, and the characteristics of children were believed to be determined by the celestial conditions present at the moment of delivery. These beliefs affected everything from the scheduling of induced labours to the interpretation of birth complications and outcomes. The intersection of medical and religious authority in matters related to childbirth created tensions that sometimes worked against the best interests of mothers and babies. Church teachings about the spiritual significance of childbirth pain could conflict with practical efforts to ease suffering, while religious restrictions on certain practices might prevent the use of techniques that could save lives. Midwives had to navigate carefully between their practical knowledge and the religious requirements of their communities. The preservation of birth-related knowledge in medieval manuscripts and medical texts provides us with glimpses into the understanding and practices of the time. Though these written sources often reflected the theoretical knowledge of male physicians rather than the practical experience of female midwives. The gap between written medical theory and actual practice was often substantial, with the women who actually attended births relying more on oral tradition and personal experience than on scholarly texts. The evolution of birthing practices during the medieval period was slow and uneven, with improvements in one area often offset by persistent problems in others. The gradual recognition of the importance of cleanliness, the development of better instruments, and the accumulation of practical knowledge all contributed to slowly improving outcomes, but progress was measured in centuries rather than years or decades. The impact of medieval childbirth practices extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence broader social attitudes about women, medicine, and the relationship between human knowledge and divine will. The acceptance of high maternal mortality rates as natural and inevitable reflected broader assumptions about women's roles and value in medieval society, while the gradual questioning of these assumptions would eventually contribute to demands for better medical care and social change. The legacy of medieval pregnancy and childbirth continues to influence modern attitudes and practices in ways that are not always obvious or acknowledged. The medicalization of birth, the emphasis on hospital delivery, and the complex relationships between medical professionals and birthing women all have roots that can be traced back to medieval attempts to improve outcomes for mothers and babies while working within the constraints of limited knowledge and social expectations. As we close this chapter of Eleanor's story and the countless others like it, we're reminded that the seemingly simple act of bringing new life into the world has always required extraordinary courage, community support, and the kind of hope that persists even in the face of overwhelming odds. The women who faced these challenges in medieval times did so with a bravery that modern medical advances have made less necessary but no less admirable. Their stories serve as a bridge between our contemporary understanding of pregnancy and childbirth and the historical experiences that shaped human attitudes toward reproduction, medical care, and women's roles in society. By understanding what these women endured, we gain a deeper appreciation not only for modern medical advances, but also for the resilience and strength that have always characterized the human response to life's greatest challenges and most profound mysteries. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep, let your thoughts linger with Eleanor and her sisters across the centuries. Women who faced the unknown with nothing but courage and the support of other women who understood that in bringing life into the world, they were participating in humanity's oldest and most sacred story. Their legacy lives on not only in the children they bore, but in the accumulated wisdom, improved practices, and deeper understanding that their sacrifices made possible for all who came after them. In the candlelit chambers of medieval Europe, where the scent of burning herbs mingled with whispered prayers, the story of pregnancy was written not in medical textbooks, but in the memories of women who had walked this perilous path before. Each birth was both an ending and a beginning, a conclusion to months of fear and preparation, and the start of new chapters that would ripple through generations yet unborn. The women who survived medieval childbirth became living libraries of knowledge, their bodies bearing the evidence of what they had endured, their minds carrying the accumulated wisdom of experience that no physician's scroll could capture. They would spend their remaining years sharing this knowledge with daughters, nieces, and neighbours, passing down not just practical advice about labour and delivery, but the deeper understanding of what it meant to risk everything for the continuation of life itself. Eleanor's story, whether it ended in triumph or tragedy, was multiplied across countless households throughout medieval Europe. In castle halls and peasant cottages, in bustling market towns and isolated farmsteads, women faced the same terrors and uncertainties that had filled her months of waiting. The particulars might vary. The quality of care might differ, but the fundamental experience remained constant across all social boundaries. Pregnancy in medieval times was a dance with death that required courage beyond modern comprehension. The ripple effects of each birth extended far beyond the immediate family circle. Successful deliveries provided hope and encouragement to other expectant mothers, proof that survival was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. Failed births cast shadows of grief that could linger for generations, serving as grim reminders of the price that medieval society extracted from its women in exchange for the continuation of family lines and the survival of communities. The midwives who had attended these births carried their own burden of memory, accumulating experiences that would inform their practice for decades to come. Each successful delivery added to their reputation and confidence, while each loss weighed heavily on hearts that understood how little they could actually control in the birthing chamber. These women developed a particular kind of wisdom, born from the intersection of practical knowledge and spiritual humility, understanding both their power to help and their limitations in the face of forces beyond human comprehension. The seasonal rhythm of medieval life meant that births occurred in cycles, with certain times of year bringing waves of pregnant women to term. Spring births were generally welcomed, offering infants their best chance of surviving the vulnerable early months in favourable weather. Summer deliveries brought different challenges, as the sealed birthing chambers became stifling hot, and the risk of spoiled food increased the danger of illness. Autumn births were shadowed by the approaching winter, while children born in the darkest months faced the greatest challenges to survival. The economic implications of medieval childbirth reverberated through entire communities. The loss of a skilled woman's labour during pregnancy and recovery affected not just her immediate family, but also the broader network of relationships and dependencies that sustained medieval society. A master craftswoman's death in childbirth meant the loss of years of accumulated knowledge and skill. A merchant's wife who died leaving young children behind created disruptions that could affect trade relationships and business partnerships for years to come. The religious communities that surrounded medieval families provided both comfort and additional pressure for women facing childbirth. Prayers were offered, masses said, and pilgrimages undertaken in hopes of ensuring safe delivery. But these spiritual interventions came with their own expectations and obligations. Women who survived were expected to demonstrate appropriate gratitude through additional religious observance, while those who lost children or died themselves were sometimes seen as having somehow failed in their spiritual duties. The superstitions that governed medieval pregnancy and childbirth served important psychological functions, even when they had no medical value. The rituals, restrictions, and carefully observed customs provided structure and meaning to experiences that were otherwise largely beyond human control. Women who followed all the prescribed practices could at least feel that they had done everything possible to ensure a favorable outcome, even when that outcome ultimately depended on factors they could neither understand nor influence. The technological limitations of medieval medicine meant that innovations in childbirth care developed slowly and often remained localized to particular regions or communities. A midwife who developed an effective technique for managing a specific complication might share her knowledge with a few apprentices, but there was no systematic way to spread improvements across wider areas. Valuable discoveries could be lost when their inventors died, while dangerous practices might persist for generations, simply because no one had access to better alternatives. The documentation of medieval childbirth experiences was sporadic and often focused more on spiritual significance than medical details. The records that survive tend to emphasize miraculous recoveries, divine interventions, and moral lessons rather than practical information about what actually worked to improve outcomes. This emphasis on the supernatural aspects of birth reflected the medieval worldview that saw divine will as the primary factor determining success or failure in all human endeavors. The social networks that developed around childbirth created lasting bonds between women who had shared these intense experiences. The relationships forged in birthing chambers often extended throughout lifetimes, creating support systems that helped women navigate not just subsequent pregnancies, but all the challenges of medieval life. These connections transcended social boundaries in ways that few other experiences could, bringing together women of different classes and backgrounds in recognition of their shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. The transformation of girls into women in medieval society was often marked by their first experience with pregnancy and childbirth, either their own or that of close family members. Young women learned early that their primary value lay in their ability to bear children, but they also learned the terrible cost that this expectation might exact. The knowledge that pregnancy could mean death cast a shadow over even the happiest marriages, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that coloured all aspects of women's reproductive lives. The medical knowledge that emerged from centuries of medieval birthing experiences laid important groundwork for future improvements in maternal care, even though much of it was flawed or dangerous by modern standards. The careful observation of symptoms, the testing of various remedies, and the gradual accumulation of practical wisdom all contributed to a body of knowledge that would eventually inform more effective treatments. The courage of women who submitted to experimental treatments and untested procedures helped advance understanding. Even when the immediate results were disappointing or tragic, the artistic and literary representations of medieval childbirth often sanitized or romanticized experiences that were actually brutal and terrifying. Religious art depicted idealized scenes of nativity and motherhood that bore little resemblance to the reality of medieval birthing chambers. Literary works might mention pregnancy and birth in passing, but rarely dwelt on the graphic details of what women actually endured. This gap between representation and reality meant that each generation of women had to discover for themselves the true nature of the ordeals they would face. The influence of medieval childbirth practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages, shaping attitudes and approaches that persisted well into the modern era. The acceptance of maternal suffering as natural and inevitable, the exclusion of women from formal medical training, and the reliance on traditional remedies over scientific investigation all had roots in medieval approaches to pregnancy and birth. Understanding this historical context helps explain why improvements in maternal care were so slow to develop and why many dangerous practices persisted long after better alternatives became available. The courage displayed by medieval women facing pregnancy and childbirth represents one of history's great unsung heroisms. These women knew the odds they faced, understood the likely consequences of their choices, and yet continued to bear children because they believed in the importance of continuing life itself. Their bravery was not the dramatic heroism of battlefields or grand gestures, but the quiet, persistent courage of people who do what must be done regardless of the personal cost. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of medieval pregnancy, we're left with profound respect for the women who navigated this treacherous terrain with such grace and determination. Their stories remind us that the miracle of birth has always required more than biological processes, demanding human courage, community support, and the kind of love that persists even in the face of almost certain loss. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of your modern world, with its hospitals and ultrasounds and epidurals, let yourself feel the weight of gratitude for how far we've travelled from those candlelit chambers where women like Eleanor face their darkest hours. The antiseptic smell of modern delivery rooms, the reassuring beep of fetal monitors, the presence of trained physicians with actual medical knowledge. These aren't just conveniences, but miracles that would have seemed like divine intervention to medieval mothers. The transformation from medieval ignorance to modern understanding didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of accumulated wisdom, countless small improvements, and the gradual recognition that women's lives had value beyond their ability to produce heirs. Each generation of midwives and physicians built upon the experiences of those who came before, slowly replacing superstition with science, tradition with evidence, fear with knowledge. Consider for a moment the simple act of washing hands before examining a pregnant woman, a practice that wouldn't become standard until the 19th century, long after the medieval period had ended. How many women died from infections that could have been prevented by something as basic as soap and water? How many babies were lost to complications that we now treat routinely? The answers are staggering, sobering reminders of how precious our modern medical knowledge truly is. The stories of women like Eleanor weren't preserved in official histories or celebrated in great chronicles. They were remembered in the quiet spaces between mothers and daughters, in the whispered advice passed from one generation to the next, in the accumulated wisdom of women who understood that survival depended on their ability to support each other through ordeals that no one else could fully comprehend. These women were the unsung architects of human survival, facing impossible odds with nothing but courage and the hope that their sacrifices would somehow contribute to a better future for their daughters and granddaughters. They couldn't have imagined a world where pregnancy tests could detect conception within days, where ultrasounds could reveal problems before birth, where cesarean sections could save both mother and child when natural delivery failed. Yet their legacy lives on in every safe delivery, every healthy baby, every mother who survives to hold her child. The knowledge we take for granted today was purchased with their blood, built upon their bones, consecrated by their courage. They were the price paid for progress, the foundation upon which modern obstetrics was built. So as your breathing slows and your eyelids grow heavy, carry with you the memory of these brave women who walked through darkness so that others might find light. Remember Eleanor and her countless sisters who faced the ultimate test of human endurance with nothing but hope and the support of other women who understood that bringing life into the world has always been humanity's most sacred and most dangerous calling. Let their stories remind you that every generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before, that every advance in human knowledge and compassion was built upon the experiences of people who suffered, so that others might not have to. In honouring their memory, we honour the long journey from ignorance to understanding, from fear to hope, from the dark chambers of medieval childbirth to the bright promise of modern medicine. Rest now, knowing that the women who came before us would marvel at the world we've created, where pregnancy is a cause for celebration rather than terror, where birth is the beginning of life rather than its likely end. Their courage made our comfort possible. Their sacrifice made our safety real, and their love, for children they might never hold, for futures they might never see, continues to light the way forward for all who come after. Sleep well, dear listener. The long night of medieval ignorance is over, and dawn has finally come.